Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where we're continuing our second batch of company challenges with a Soviet motor rifle company riding about in BTRs. Like last time, I've chosen the top available option wherever possible, basically meaning that we're dealing with BTR-70s, but one key difference is in the enemy force. This is in an era where both sides are very specifically organising and equipping themselves to fight the other. So it doesn't make an awful lot of sense to run the Soviets against themselves when we run the Americans against their intended opponent. So I've swapped the defenders for an American platoon. This actually lines up quite well with the Soviet force I used last time. US platoons already have 2 machine guns and an FO team. The M47 Dragon is a reasonable analogue to the AT-7, and while the rifle squads don't have RPGs or organic PKs, they do have more men, grenade launchers, and Law 66s, so it's a relatively straight swap. The armoured counterattack, or returning combat patrol, or whatever this is supposed to be, is a little more difficult to convert, mostly because the Soviets have a broadly linear progression in their armour, while the Americans have a significant step up represented by the Abrams. In the end, I went for M113s and an M60A1 Rise passive, which is almost just to check that the company has any anti-tank capability at all, but is also representative of what they might have thrown at them, so it's probably a better option than going Abrams from the get-go. The Motor Rifle Company in BTRs is a very different kind of formation than the US Mechanized Company we looked at last time. Down at squad level we have 7 men with an RPG-7, an RPK-74, which is arguably more of a squad automatic weapon than an LMG, an RPG-18 one-shot disposable anti-tank weapon, a GP-25 underbarrel grenade launcher, and 6 AK-74s. The first squad in each platoon also replaces one of the AKs with an SVD marksman rifle. There are 3 of these squads in each platoon, led by a platoon commander who's totally on his own. They ride about in 3 BTR-70s. The BTR is somewhat comparable to the M113. It has a crew of 2, it's lightly armoured and primarily armed with a heavy machine gun, in this case a 40.5mm KPV. On the other hand, wheels instead of tracks means it has worse cross-country performance, and the rear-mounted engine translates into awkward dismounting via hatches instead of a convenient rear ram. The Motor Rifle Company as a whole is commanded by a 5-man HQ element in another BTR-70, and backed up by a weapons platoon. This has its own individual commander, and consists of 3 PKM machine gun teams and 3 AT-7 ATGM teams that drive around in another 2 BTR-70s. And that's it, that's the whole company. It's much smaller than its American counterpart, it has less firepower, and in an interesting parallel to some of the World War II companies, we could say it has its weapons embedded a level higher. The Motor Rifle Company weapons platoon, for example, has GPMGs and infantry ATGMs, but these are embedded in the rifle squads in the American organisation. The US weapons platoon has vehicle-mounted ATGMs and a medium mortar section, assets that the motor rifles just don't have. So our Soviet company here is, at least on paper, less capable of independent action than the American company we looked at last time. That's not because the Soviets didn't think that individual companies needed the same level of organic assets, it's because in this case we're using an out-of-the-box company that is intended to operate as part of a larger motor rifle battalion, which does have more organic fire support. When the Soviets intended individual companies to operate independently, they absolutely bulked them out to proper mini-combined arms formations. The classic forward security element is a motor rifle company that's been reinforced with tanks and heavy mortars. But we're not taking the FSE out for this run, we're just using a basic BTR company, which I'm going to be handling as I think is best, not by trying to translate what we know about Soviet doctrine. On the one hand, this makes planning very easy. I don't have to coordinate indirect fires or smoke because, well, I don't have any. The lack of smoke means that I really need to take advantage of the terrain to get forward, so I want to use the same avenue of attack as last time, advancing up the right to hit Objective Alpha. I can dismount part of the weapons platoon and send them forward into the wood to act as a base of fire. The range is a little bit long for the PKMs, but they're tripod mounted, so they should be effective if they're concentrated. Again, like with the M113s, I don't want to use the BTRs for longer ranged fire support because they're just so vulnerable. Something I need to worry about more than the run of the Americans is making sure I send some anti-tank capability up rapidly. Without the security offered by the long-range tow vehicles I had hiding in the back, I'm going to need to bring the 1 kilometer anti-tank bubble of the AT-7s with me to deal with the counterattack when that turns up. First off though, the machine gun half of the weapons platoon dives into the woods. I'm sending it to the far left corner to set up a base of fire. This takes longer than I was anticipating, primarily because the BTR struggled somewhat with the undergrowth, and it's not until 5 minutes in that they're in position. While the 3 PKMs direct some speculative fire at the front of the farm, I throw the entire rest of the company forward. Just like last time, the BTRs dash across the open ground between the wood and the valley on the right, and just like last time, all the same concepts of minimizing exposure to ATGMs apply. They all make it with no sign of activity from the farm. Continuing the trend, I inevitably end up making the same decisions when it comes to tackling the break-in as well. At a fundamental level, the BTR-70 and M113 aren't all that different, and the technical characteristics of vehicles, weapons and equipment inevitably inform tactics. Organisationally though, I'm definitely being channeled towards using more mass. I didn't feel confident trying to shoot my way onto Objective Alpha with a single platoon of 4 M113s. A single platoon of 3 BTRs clearly has less firepower. That said, I do have the 3 PKMs in support, and I'm able to get 2 of 2nd Platoon squads up to the corner of Alpha, where they disembark without trouble. Conspicuously absent is any smoke. These BTRs don't have smoke launchers, which are always really useful. Squad 2-2 would certainly have found some smoke useful as they run across the gap between A1 and A2 to make room for their platoon HQ to come up. 2 of them get caught by enemy fire coming through the keyhole from across the Alpha yard. A stray round manages to score a partial penetration in the side of their BTR, which went with them, and the crew proceeds to try and disengage by reversing off. It's chased away by 2 Law 66 rockets and a 40mm grenade, all of which fall just short, followed by a much larger Dragon missile that impacts in the gap besides the suddenly very suppressed 2nd Platoon commander. Besides confirming that this is the luckiest BTR in Germany, this little engagement reveals that there's at least 2 enemy teams in A5, the only building with line of sight on the vehicle through the keyhole. Naturally, this leads to a simple reaction: fix them and any other Americans across the yard to their front by occupying A1 and A2, while I bring 1st Platoon up on the right to take buildings A7 and 8 to hit them in the flank. In the event, both elements end up going in at the same time. There's a short firefight, but the Americans are pretty clustered up at the windows and a couple of RPGs decisively tilt the battle in my favour. That position, with a 5-man fire team and a Dragon team, contained the only defenders in Alpha. After they're neutralised, I spend another couple of turns securing the area to confirm that I've achieved my break-in and gotten a foothold. So far so good, but where to go from here is another question. Leapfrogging directly onto Bravo didn't exactly go very well last time, and I think the effects of the PKM base of fire in the woods will be counterbalanced by the smaller, less casualty-resistant motor rifle platoons. So instead I'm thinking more about moving on to Charlie. Alpha presents a much better base of fire position, the PKs can still contribute by firing into the centre of the farm, and while there is still the possibility of crossfire from Bravo, I can at least put some fire down in that direction from Alpha. Moving teams from 1st Platoon into buildings A4, 5 and 6 quickly reveals enemy soldiers across from them in the C2-5 block. Another firefight quickly ensues. In hindsight, it's quite obvious that this one was over within 2 or 3 turns. There's an M60 team in C5 which is rapidly taken out by successive RPG hits, and the American platoon HQ in C3, which also goes down in short order. This wasn't how it appeared at the time though. Just when I felt like I was getting fire superiority, one of 1st Platoon's teams in A6 lost a man to a 40mm grenade, and their supporting BTR, peeking around the edge of the building, ate another one which killed the gunner. That led me to believe that the enemy in C3 was still in the fight, and that there might be another team in C2. The reality is that these 40mm grenades were coming from much further back, an American grenadier firing from the single window of building C12 that had line of sight onto the corner of Alpha. Without realising this, my solution to winning the firefight with the first C block was to bring 3rd Platoon around to supplement my base of fire from hull down on the slope. This platoon had been hanging around with the company HQ in the 87s in the valley on the right since leaving the deployment zone, and I was facing the same problem I had with the Americans of simultaneously needing to get my force out of the open and not cram so much stuff into Alpha that it became a prime target for the enemy mortars. Bringing 3rd Platoon up onto the flank was a safer option than trying to advance through the centre of the farm, providing that they weren't there too long or found themselves exposed to the counterattack. With this extra injection of firepower, I'm able to get some scouts across to Charlie from Alpha. Critically, they didn't take any fire from the direction of Bravo, and with the first Charlie block apparently suppressed, it's not long before I bring up the rest of their squad. Evidently buildings C2 through 5 are clear, but 3rd Platoon is still receiving the odd inaccurate 40mm grenade. This has prompted me to dismount that platoon, primarily to avoid losing an entire squad to a lucky HEDP shot, but also because it allows me to add their RPGs and RPKs to the suppressive fire of their vehicles. And this in turn leads me into trying to exploit to the right of the first Charlie block. The buildings are really some kind of long barn. They don't have doors on the side, just at the ends. And because you can't go through the windows in this version of Combat Mission, I have to go left or right to keep moving forward. I don't want to go left towards Bravo when I'm already putting loads of fire down on the right. The lucky team that gets to peek the corner and try and hook around to enter C2 is an assault team from 1-2. They immediately come under fire from C12, my first actual spot of the enemy in that corner of Charlie, then more Americans open up from C13. 1-2A takes a casualty and rather sensibly runs away, heading off to the left and ending up in C1. 1-2B, following them up, finishes the turn on the corner, which is a very awkward and exposed action square thanks to the diagonal building footprint. They're about to get shot up whatever I do, so I decide to go for it and maintain their orders to get into building C2. They make it, but they lose a man in the process. This just about takes us to the 25-minute mark. Alpha is secure, and I'm bringing the company HQ and 87s up. The PKs are still in the wood. The first platoon is on the face of Charlie with some casualties, and their BTRs are back at Alpha. Second platoon is holding that objective, and third platoon is hugging the crest on the right, trying to suppress the enemy cluster on the Charlie corner about 200 meters away. I'm slowly coming to the realization that Charlie is a nightmare of an objective to try and clear. The two large blocks, C2 to 5 and 6 to 9, are only accessible at either end, and because they're essentially barns or warehouses, their far or southwestern sides have no windows. So taking one block just gets you the block. You can't use it as a base of fire position if you're attacking from my direction. In other words, I really need to clear Charlie from either left or right. I can't go through it head on. I'm already engaged on the right. Third platoon is in a shootout with American teams in C12, C13 and C6, all of which dominate the entrances to the two blocks on that side. To make this approach work, I need to clear those positions. Third platoon might be able to manage that, but they're going to need to do so quickly because time is getting on and that armoured counterattack is going to arrive at some point. At the same time, although I'm committed with third platoon, two men from 1-2 ended up in building C1 on the other flank, and they haven't come under fire yet. There's no sign of enemy activity in Bravo at all. I've been watching it from the woods, I've got squads and BTRs in Alpha observing it, and infantry I've pushed across the open ground between Alpha and Charlie hasn't taken any fire from that direction. So Bravo might be clear, or at least lightly held. Moving into Bravo to set up another base of fire and then attacking Charlie from the left might be a better option than persisting on the right where I know that there's resistance. In hindsight, which is a phrase that acts as a key indicator here, I should have picked one of these options. I should have decided to go left or go right. Instead, I kind of sleepwalked into doing both at the same time. I started to peel third platoon to the right to get better angles onto the Charlie corner. and I sent a squad to reinforce C1 and probe that angle. This immediately starts to go a little sideways. Even before the reinforcing squad arrives in C1, 1-2A's 2 survivors in there come under fire from C9. We get another firefight as more bodies pile in, and this time things go a lot worse for the Soviets. At this range, the American 40mm grenades are lethal, and soon both the original inhabitants and 1-1, the reinforcing squad, are down 3 or 4 men and pinned. But again, there's no sign of life in Bravo. I send a 2-man scout team from 2nd Platoon's position in Alpha to check the triangular wood between them and Bravo. They come under fire, but from C9, not from any of the closer buildings. Hot on their heels is a BTR, which gets into the triangle and opens up. Soon I've pushed 2-3 across behind it to occupy B1 and open up yet another angle. In combination with readjusted fire from the PKs in depth, all this firepower looks like it forces the enemy's heads down. Taking a risk to quickly exploit and gain some ground, I try to catalyse with 1-2B and run them across to storm the building from C5. They quickly get shot up from a new American position in C8, which is out of sight of my base of fire. They lose a man, go to pieces, and run off towards Bravo. While all this has been going on, I've been moving 3rd Platoon around on the right to try and close the distance with C12 for an assault. This has resulted in a handful of casualties so far and a couple of 40mm strikes on the BTRs. Trying to find a balance between keeping the BTRs at arm's length and minimising the distance the infantry have to assault dismounted is tough. 3-2 piles out too early, come under fire, take casualties and go to ground. 3-1 and the platoon HQ come in close and lose a man to a 40mm grenade before they've even gotten out. Close shave given the BTR's propensity to go up in flames. 3-1's BTR can at least rake buildings C12 and 13 with its HMG from that position as the infantry dismount and close in for the kill. Joined at the headline by a diminished 3-2, a storm of AK fire and some well-placed hand grenades finally finish off the intractable American team in C12. Exploiting forward, C1 gets into C12 and savagely guns down the enemy in C13, only to come under fire from an M60 in C15, another new unsuppressed position hidden from my fire support. They lose a couple of men but don't fare as badly as 3-3. This squad and its BTR were moving up from their positions suppressing C12, and the infantry are caught in the open by the enemy team in C8. It's another keyhole. The Americans managed to wipe out what remains of the squad. For all these problems though, the defenders are slowly getting ground down. Confirmation that Bravo is clear allows me to extend left to keep opening new angles on the continually offensive C block, while the Charlie corner that has given me so much grief finally crumbles away with a final effort from what's left of 3rd Platoon. In the process of occupying Bravo, I'm able to mop up the 2nd Dragon team in B8, allowing me to send up one of the AT-7s from Alpha to take that position for myself. This also means that the PKs don't have any targets, and they really need to grab more ammunition, so I've remounted them and brought them up as well. As we get into minute 40, there's an apparently indigestible hard core of psychotic Americans holed up in C8, but I've got a toehold in Charlie and Bravo is basically secure along with Alpha. Some of the platoons are running on fumes though. I feel like I've lost a lot of men and used an atrocious amount of ammunition. A couple of 3rd Platoon's BTRs are actually completely out, though the dismounts can still resupply from them. But one final push to clear out C should seal the deal, hopefully before I have to pivot to dealing with the American counterattack, but they have one final trick up their sleeve. Something explodes near the farm, a spotting round. I don't have any mortars, so it can only be the enemy. After a minute or so, 107mm high explosive bombs start raining down between Bravo and Charlie, filling that avenue of attack with blast and shrapnel. I'm not advancing through that, but I'm in no position to push the other flank either, so C8 will have to wait. The culprits are the enemy FO team, which I've stumbled onto in B13. They don't last long, but they have got their fire mission off. And of course, the counterattack arrives before the mortars finish. My first indication of this is one of 3rd Platoon's BTRs getting a 105 shaped hole punched through it before it bursts into flames. In this run, the counterattack comes in on the left, and it's only luck that I have one of the AT-7 teams just arriving in its new position in B8 to deal with them quickly. The team immediately puts a missile into the side of the M60's turret and knocks it out. They take some return 50 cal fire from one of the M113s which pins them, but they've made the critical impact. I'm not worried about a couple of M113s. As they advance up the left, they pass the edge of Bravo and enter line of sight of my other 2 AT-7s, hastily shuffled over from the other side of Alpha. Rather anticlimactically, they in the first AT-7 have absolutely no problem polishing the M113s off. With the entire armoured counterattack out of the picture, the enemy surrenders. And thank God for that. All in all, our motor rifle company here took 33 casualties and lost a BTR. That's well over a platoon's worth of losses, so I think we can safely say we're going to have to reorganise a bit. We can also say that I probably really got lucky with the BTRs. They definitely took some hits and near misses, but I was probably saved from having a really bad day by the poor deployment of the Dragon teams. The Americans have literally one man left at the end of the battle, the M60 driver who managed to get out before his tank brewed up. Of the remainder, 53 became casualties and 12 surrendered. But boy did they make me work for it. A major component of the difficulty I had was the concentration of enemy teams in Charlie. The distribution of teams is random, though the AT weapons and FO are more likely to end up on the outside edge where they can actually contribute. In this particular run, Alpha and Bravo only had 2 teams each. Everything else was not only in Charlie, but skewed towards that far right corner. So this certainly offered quite a different challenge to the first run. It definitely felt like a much tougher nut to crack. That said, what we need to figure out is whether that's because of the enemy distribution, my decisions, or the TOE of a motor rifle company in BTRs. Let's go over our 3 tasks: the break-in, clearing the objective, and dealing with the armoured counterattack. The approach in break-in was pretty straightforward. It panned out pretty much exactly the same way as it did with the American M113 company. I talked in the first episode about mounted versus dismounted firepower, having to bring more vehicles to the party, and the whole when and where do we dismount issue. In the event it went smoothly, though it could have been more painful than it was. A big difference between the BTRs and the M113s is that the Americans have smoke launchers, and they were a big help in putting down some immediate obscuration on the toehold. These particular BTRs aren't equipped with smoke launchers, and that means that the keyhole between A1 and A2 was not blocked off when I moved past. That resulted in a couple of infantry casualties, and I got real lucky that everything the enemy threw at the BTR missed. It really should have been taken out. Aside from that, with the enemy identified, it was easy enough to overwhelm them. Again, a lucky break with the random deployment. If that Dragon team had been located in the outer edge of Alpha, it could have engaged the BTRs on the approach with potentially fatal consequences. What's perhaps more interesting is my follow-on fumblings with 3rd Platoon taking on the Charlie corner. I think that they can give us some good insight into just how difficult the break-in could have been had I made different decisions. 3rd Platoon was basically up against 3 fire teams, and it had a serious struggle gaining fire superiority. Even with the infantry kicked out and inside effective small arms range, it was really difficult getting the Americans to keep their heads down. A single motor rifle platoon with BTRs just didn't have enough firepower to bully its way forward. I haven't tried it with an M113 platoon, but we can certainly say that they could put more lead out and would probably have an easier time, especially going up against smaller Soviet teams with less firepower. So it looks a lot like using single platoons is problematic, even against smaller enemy units. Getting back to thinking about the break-in, we also got to see how dangerous it was for the infantry to dismount too early and try to cross open ground, and how dangerous it was for them to try and close with an unsuppressed enemy whilst mounted. The reality of the when to dismount question is that you can be screwed whatever you decide. The critical factor is how suppressed the enemy is. A distant drop-off and a slower approach requires suppressive fire to go on for a longer time, a closer dismount requires much better synchronization between advancing and supporting elements. The effectiveness of modern weaponry means that the defender only needs a very small window to absolutely ruin your day. In this case, the difficulty in suppressing the defenders enough for any length of time when the BTR platoon's fire inevitably had to slacken off to enable an advance was a real problem. What I really needed to do was send at least one other platoon to back third up. That way they would have had more firepower, and that could have helped them get the job done faster with lower casualties. That I didn't do that is probably a reflection of my misuse of a formation designed around mass. I failed to fully commit to either avenue of attack into Charlie, and that meant that 3rd Platoon had to struggle forward on its own. But that's not the whole story. We're well into clearing the objective here, and I also faced problems on the other flank. Again, there's a mass problem, but to go along with my decision making, we have to factor in the terrain. Complex terrain with limited line of sight just makes it more difficult to use mass. I'm not confident I could have deployed more than one platoon and its vehicles between Alpha and Bravo to try and tackle Charlie if I had tried. And if I had, the angles of the buildings would mean that different enemy positions in the Charlie blocks would be exposed to different volumes of firepower, if any at all. There are simply situations in which combat falls back onto the actions of individual teams and vehicles, urban warfare being a prime example. That means that TOEs that push firepower and capabilities further down will have an advantage. It's notable that in the first two firefights, engaging across the Alpha yard and between Alpha and Charlie, I came out on top very quickly because I could mass the fire of 4 or 5 teams against 2 smaller US teams. The enemy teams in C8 and C9, on the other hand, occupied defilade positions that were much harder to concentrate fire onto, and they managed to chew up almost 2 squads worth of Soviets. They caused 13 casualties between them. And these US rifle squads are the light variant that doesn't have embedded M60s or Dragons. We can absolutely lay the blame for most, if not all, of these casualties on me. These were not decisive engagements because I did not act decisively. I created casualties by introducing more Soviet teams, squads and BTRs to the left-hand flank piecemeal, and by trying to cross open ground without having first suppressed building C8. Where I also think it's very hard to disentangle my decision making from the difficulties of deploying mass in that kind of restricted terrain against enemy positions in defilade. This particular company organisation, the pure BTR company intended to act as part of a larger unit, doesn't have the 2 go-to problem solvers for this kind of situation. It doesn't have the other 2 legs of the combined arms tripod, armour and artillery. Notably, the Americans from the first run were hardly complete in that respect. They had no tanks, and 81mm mortars aren't exactly the best tool for digging the enemy out of buildings. But they did have more firepower at squad and team level, significantly more firepower that could be more easily brought to bear. Standing in very stark contrast to the slow and painful progress of the most rifle platoons, dealing with the armoured counterattack was almost underwhelmingly easy. This could be a simple function of the fact that there should probably be some quotation marks around the armoured part of the counterattack. Neither the M60A1 nor the M113s are well armoured. We saw in the first run that the M113s are very vulnerable to RPG fire. The M60 isn't that much better really. A more specialised anti-tank weapon like the AT-7 has absolutely no problems destroying either, providing it can connect. The tricky part was more an exercise in having the AT-7s in the right place at the right time. They spent the first half of the battle in the valley on the right, waiting for space to clear in the Alpha objective so they could move up, getting to some buildings and provide anti-tank security. Alpha's really not a bad position for this. It can see almost all the right flank and about half the left. One of the AT-7 teams engaged from here, but the star of the show was the one that I sent forward to the edge of Bravo to get better eyes onto the left. And that one was only just getting into position when the counterattack came in. They never actually deployed their weapon, they were firing it from the semi-deployed position, whatever that is. Regardless, that team accounted for the M60 and 2 of the 3 M113s, pretty much by virtue of being in the right place at the right time. Should the enemy have gotten closer, there were still some RPG-7s and RPG-18s left amongst the infantry, and I don't think the M113s would react very well to close-range fire from the heavy machine guns on the BTRs. So again, like with the Americans, we've got some anti-tank depth, to the surprise of absolutely no one, given the mechanized nature of any prospective Cold War gone hot, but this depth is significantly less than that provided by the M901 tow vehicles of the M113 company. This somewhat brings us round full circle. That deficit in AT capability is a direct result of the Americans embedding weapon systems and capabilities at lower levels than the Soviets. In the anti-tank dimension, this wasn't that big a deal in this scenario because the counterattack comes within the 1 kilometer don't tread on me bubble of both the AT-7 and the Dragon. But it was a big deal for the infantry. The motor rifle platoons really struggled here because of their table of organisation and equipment. They have less manpower, less firepower, and when the terrain, or command decisions, or enemy action, or any number of other things restrict their ability to overwhelm the enemy with mass, they're fighting at a significant disadvantage. And to some extent, this shouldn't be surprising. Like I keep saying, this particular company is not intended to be operating independently. It's intended to be operating as a small cog in a much larger battalion or regimental sized combined arms team. Now that we've established a kind of baseline with the bare bones TOEs for the Americans and Soviets though, we can start to add things in and get that combined arms machine working. It's going to be super interesting seeing how a BTR based forward security element fares compared to this company. But first I think we'll cycle back to the Americans and see how our M113 company does when we take out one of the mechanized platoons and put a tank platoon in there instead. Hope you all found this enjoyable and interesting. There's a lot more carnage this time around. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.